November 18, 1966. Long Tan District, Phuoc Tuy Province. A Viet Cong squad leader we'll call Nguyen crouched in a spider hole, his AK-47 trained on the jungle path ahead. He'd been fighting Americans for 2 years now, survived their artillery, their helicopters, their endless firepower. He knew the drill. When the Americans came, you fought until you died, or they gave up. Surrender meant torture, maybe death. That's what the cadre leaders said. That's what everyone knew. But these weren't Americans approaching through the rubber trees. The footsteps were wrong. Too quiet. No radio chatter, no cigarette smoke, no metallic clanking of equipment. Nguyen strained to hear them. These soldiers moved like the jungle itself. When the first figure materialized 15 meters away, Nguyen's finger tensed on the trigger. The soldier wore the same green uniform as the Americans, carried similar weapons. But something was different. The way he moved, the way he read the terrain, the way he simply stopped and looked directly at Nguyen's concealed position. "We know you're there, mate," a voice said in accented but clear Vietnamese. "You've got 2 choices." Nguyen had never heard an enemy soldier speak his language before, never heard one acknowledge his presence without immediately opening fire. In that moment, staring at the weathered face of an Australian SAS soldier who'd somehow spotted his expertly camouflaged position, Nguyen made a decision that would have been unthinkable with American forces. He slowly raised his hands and emerged from the spider hole. He wouldn't be the last. Not by a long shot. When Australia committed combat troops to Vietnam in 1965, American commanders barely noticed. The initial deployment of 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, alongside the soon-to-arrive Australian and New Zealand SAS squadrons seemed almost quaint compared to the massive American buildup. These were the guys from that island down under, right? Probably fight like the British, all parade ground drill and formal tactics, completely unsuited for jungle warfare. The Viet Cong held similar assumptions. "We were told the Australians were just more white foreigners like the Americans," recalled former VC fighter Tran Van Tra in a 1995 interview. "We thought they would be easier to fight because they had fewer men and less support. We were told they would be the weak link in the Allied forces." General William Westmoreland's assessment was more diplomatic but equally dismissive. In a December 1965 memo, he noted the Australians would be adequate for defensive operations in their assigned tactical area, but expressed doubts about their ability to adapt to the unique demands of counterinsurgency operations in Southeast Asia. Translation: nice to have more bodies, but don't expect miracles from a Commonwealth backwater military. The prevailing wisdom seemed airtight. The Americans had overwhelming firepower, the latest technology, and unlimited resources. Their strategy of search and destroy operations, massive fire support, and body counts made perfect sense to Pentagon planners. Find the enemy, fix them with superior mobility, and annihilate them with superior firepower. The Australians, with their limited resources and tiny force structure, would simply have to follow the American playbook and hope for the best. Even the Australian brass seemed to accept this logic initially. There was pressure to conform to American tactics and doctrine, remembered Colonel Ian Teague, who served as a liaison officer in 1966. The Americans had all the helicopters, the artillery support, the logistics. It was easier to just plug into their system. But something unexpected happened when Australian forces began independent operations in Phuoc Tuy Province. The Viet Cong, those supposedly fanatical fighters who would rather die than surrender to Americans, started giving up. Not in small numbers either. In 1s and 2s at first, then in squads, sometimes even entire platoons. American intelligence officers noticed the anomaly but couldn't explain it. The Australian sector showed unusually high Chiu Hoi rates. Noted a March 1967 MACV intelligence summary referring to the South Vietnamese open arms program that encouraged enemy defections. Reasons unclear. Possible correlation with lower Australian troop density creating reduced combat pressure. They were looking in exactly the wrong direction. To understand why Viet Cong surrendered to Australians but fought Americans to the death, you need to understand where Australian tactical doctrine came from. And it wasn't a textbook. It was written in blood in the jungles of Malaya. From 1948 to 1960, Australian forces fought communist insurgents in the Malayan Emergency alongside British and Commonwealth forces. Unlike the conventional battles of World War II or Korea, Malaya demanded a completely different approach. The enemy wore no uniforms, blended with the civilian population, and melted into the jungle after attacks. Sound familiar? Malaya taught us that firepower was secondary to fieldcraft, explained Major Harry Smith, who would later command at the Battle of Long Tan. The British tried massive sweeps and cordon operations at first. Didn't work. We learned that 3 good trackers were worth a battalion if you used them right. The Australian Army developed a doctrine called counter-revolutionary warfare that emphasized 4 principles fundamentally different from American methods. First, extended patrol operations. Australian infantry units would spend weeks in the bush, living like guerrillas themselves. They learned to move silently, to read the jungle, to think like their enemy. As one Australian sergeant put it, "We didn't visit the jungle. We lived in the bloody thing." Second, minimal force escalation. Unlike American forces that would call in massive fire support at the first sign of contact, Australians were trained to assess, isolate, and neutralize with precision. We were taught that every artillery strike was a political decision, not just a tactical one, recalled SS Sergeant Ron Boxall. Civilian casualties created more enemies than they killed. Third, intelligence-driven operations. The Australians obsessed over intelligence gathering. They interrogated prisoners carefully and respectfully. They studied enemy documents. They tracked enemy movements with near-scientific precision. American Colonel David Hackworth, who observed Australian operations, noted, "They knew the names of local VC commanders. They knew which trails were used for what purpose. They knew the enemy's routine like they were reading his mail." Fourth, hearts and minds. This wasn't a slogan for Australians. It was operational doctrine. Civil affairs weren't an afterthought. They were integrated into combat operations. Build a school, patrol the area, provide medical care, protect the villagers. Simple but consistently applied. When Australian forces arrived in Vietnam, they brought this hard-won doctrine with them. The problem was that nobody in Saigon or Washington wanted to hear it. The Americans had their own plan, and it was working just fine. Thank you very much. Why would combat-proven, technology-superior American forces need advice from a military that hadn't fought a major war since Korea? The turning point came in February 1966, when Australian and American forces conducted a joint operation near Bien Hoa. The Americans moved in company strength, using helicopters for insertion and immediate extraction if they hit contact. Lots of radio traffic, lots of noise. When they made contact with a VC unit, they called in artillery and airstrikes, expended thousands of rounds, and reported 12 enemy KIA. The Australian SAS squadron, operating in the same area that week, took a different approach. 4-man patrols, moving on foot, sometimes staying in position for days. When they located a VC base camp, they didn't call in an airstrike. They watched. They learned the enemy's patterns. Then they ambushed a supply column at night, killing 17 and capturing 4, along with detailed intelligence documents that led to the destruction of 3 other VC positions. The Americans couldn't believe we'd spend 3 days watching a target instead of just bombing it, remembered SAS Corporal John Smith. But those 4 prisoners told us more about VC operations in 2 hours than a month of body counts. August 18, 1966. Long Tan Rubber Plantation. D Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, 108 men, found themselves surrounded by an estimated $2,000 to 2,500 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops from the 275th and D445 battalions. By every measure, D Company should have been annihilated. They were outnumbered 20-1. The monsoon rain was so heavy that air support was delayed, and artillery fire had to be adjusted by sound rather than sight. The VC had maneuvered brilliantly, using the weather and terrain to achieve complete tactical surprise. But what happened next revealed the profound difference between Australian and American tactical approaches, and why it mattered to enemy surrender rates. Major Harry Smith made a decision that would have seemed insane to American commanders. Instead of calling in immediate massive fire support and attempting extraction, he kept his company together in a tight defensive position and fought the battle at close range. His men, trained in the Australian doctrine of fire discipline and ammunition conservation, made every shot count. "We were taught to identify targets, not just spray and pray," recalled Private Noel Grimes. "You didn't fire unless you could see what you were shooting at." The battle raged for 3 hours. The Australian artillery support, when it finally arrived, was precise and controlled. No massive B-52 strikes carpet-bombing everything within a kilometer. No napalm turning the entire area into an inferno. Just 3,000 shells from the New Zealand artillery battery at Nui Dat, directed with such accuracy that rounds were landing within 50 meters of Australian positions. Here's what the Viet Cong experienced at Long Tan versus typical American engagements. American pattern. Heavy contact leads to overwhelming firepower. Artillery, helicopter gunships, tactical airstrikes, sometimes B-52 strikes. Everything within the target box gets obliterated. Survival rate if you stay near 0. If you're wounded, you're definitely dead. If you surrender, you'll probably die in the bombardment anyway. Rational decision. Fight until you can break contact, then run. Australian pattern at Long Tan. Intense small arms fight, but discriminate fire. Artillery is accurate, but focused. When Australian reinforcements arrived in APCs, armored personnel carriers, the VC retreat wasn't met with pursuit by fire support that would kill indiscriminately. Instead, Australian infantry advanced methodically, securing the battlefield. The battlefield count told an extraordinary story. 245 VC NVA dead, 3 captured, an estimated 500+ wounded who were carried away. Australian casualties, 18 killed, 24 wounded. By body count metrics, an overwhelming Australian victory. But here's what changed everything. In the 3 months following Long Tan, Cheo Hoi rates in Phuoc Tuy Province increased by 400%. One of those defectors, former VC platoon leader Levan Phuoc, explained why in his debriefing. After Long Tan, the story spread through our ranks. The Australians had fought with discipline. They could have called in their aircraft to bomb everything, but they didn't. When their soldiers found our wounded the next day, they gave them medical treatment. This was unexpected. We were told the foreigners were cruel, that surrender meant torture and death. But the Australians were different. The pattern emerged across multiple engagements through late 1966 and 1967. Operation Ingham, August-September 1966. Australian forces made contact with D445 Battalion multiple times. Instead of massive fire assaults, they used squad-level tactics with precision support. Result: 37 VC killed, 14 captured, including 3 wounded who were treated by Australian medics. 2 Australian dead. Operation Smithfield, November 1966. When an Australian patrol encountered a VC company, the patrol commander, instead of calling immediate artillery, maneuvered his men to cut off escape routes while radio operator called for blocking forces. The VC realized they were trapped but not being annihilated with fire support. 23 surrendered. They could have killed us all with their artillery, one prisoner told interrogators. Instead, they gave us a choice. Operation Paddington, February 1967. The most telling incident. A VC squad was cornered in a village by an Australian patrol. The patrol commander, Sergeant Kevin Walsh, did something almost unthinkable. He announced in Vietnamese, taught to him by Kit Carson's scouts, that the VC had 1 minute to surrender or the house would be destroyed. He didn't say, "or we'll kill you all." He said the house would be destroyed, giving them a clear understanding that this was about property, not massacre. All 7 VC soldiers walked out with their hands up. The Americans would have just thrown in grenades and called in artillery on the whole village. Walsh later explained. We learned in Malaya that giving the enemy a genuine choice to surrender, not just saying the words, but actually meaning it, saved lives on both sides and got you better intelligence. The statistical difference was stark. American forces in 3 Corps, 1966-1967. Approximately 15,000 enemy KIA, 800 prisoners, 5.3% capture rate. Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy, same period. Approximately 1,200 enemy KIA, 280 prisoners, 23% capture rate. The Australians were capturing enemy soldiers at more than 4 times the rate of American forces. And their Chio Hoi defection rates in Phuoc Tuy Province ran 3 times higher than adjacent American operational areas. The intelligence windfall was staggering. The Australians were pulling in VC and NVA prisoners who gave us detailed information on enemy order of battle, logistics, and operations, noted CIA analyst Frank Snepp. American units were getting body counts. The Australians were getting the enemy's playbook. As Australian tactical effectiveness became undeniable, both the Americans and the Viet Cong had to adapt in very different ways. American evolution, reluctant and incomplete. By mid-1967, some American units began quietly adopting Australian techniques. The 173rd Airborne Brigade requested Australian advisors for their reconnaissance platoons. Special Forces A-teams studied Australian patrol reports. Even the 1st Cavalry Division, the epitome of American helicopter mobility doctrine, started extending patrol durations and reducing their signature. We called it Going Australian, recalled Captain James Shelton, 173rd Airborne. Less radio traffic, smaller units, longer times in the bush. The brass didn't like it because it didn't generate the body counts and contact reports they wanted for the daily briefings. But it kept more of my men alive, and we started getting actual intelligence instead of just grid coordinates of bomb craters. The Australian Training Team Vietnam, AATTV, which advised South Vietnamese units, became legendary for producing effective combat forces. Their methods were simple, but ran counter to American doctrine. We taught them to patrol like hunters, not like an army on parade, explained Warrant Officer Kevin Dasher Wheatley, who would posthumously receive the Victoria Cross. We showed them that you could own the night if you were willing to live rough and think like the enemy. Yet American command structure remained wedded to search and destroy operations with massive fire support. General Crichton Abrams, who succeeded Westmoreland in 1968, was more receptive to Australian methods, but by then the war's trajectory was set. The Australians had it right from the start, Abrams privately told his staff in 1969. But we'd built an entire war machine around different principles. Changing course was like trying to turn an aircraft carrier with a canoe paddle. Vietnamese counter-evolution, fear and adaptation. The Viet Cong and NVA response to Australian tactics was more complex and more revealing. From captured documents and prisoner interrogations, a clear pattern emerged. VC commanders issued specific guidance about fighting Australians versus Americans. A March 1967 directive from D445 Battalion Headquarters, captured during Operation Renmark, explicitly stated, "When facing Australian forces, maintain maximum dispersion and avoid encirclement at all costs. The Australians will offer surrender opportunities that may seem genuine. Revolutionary discipline must be maintained." The directive reveals everything. VC leadership had to explicitly order their troops not to surrender to Australians because it was becoming a problem. You don't issue orders against something that isn't happening. But the orders often didn't work. The grassroots reality was overwhelming the ideology. "We were told the Australians were just as bad as the Americans," recalled Tran Din Tan, former VC company commander who defected in 1968. But our men knew differently. They knew from the prisoners who came back through exchanges. They knew from villagers. The Australians could be harsh in combat, but they were not cruel. They did not destroy villages randomly. They did not shoot prisoners. This created a fascinating tactical problem for the VC. They had to avoid contact with Australians because their troops' morale would crack. Several captured after-action reports from 1967-68 show VC units deliberately maneuvering away from Australian positions to engage American forces instead. A June 1968 intelligence report from 274th VC Regiment stated, "Contact with Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy Province to be avoided when possible. Their tracking capabilities and patient tactics make disengagement difficult. Priority targets remain American forces, whose aggressive tactics allow for counter-ambush opportunities." Read that carefully. The VC preferred fighting Americans because American tactics were more predictable, and because American overwhelming firepower paradoxically made it easier to break contact or avoid surrender situations. The SAS factor. Australian and New Zealand SAS squadrons operating in Phuoc Tuy took the doctrine to its extreme. These men were tracking specialists who could follow a week-old trail through the jungle. They learned Vietnamese, studied local customs, and operated in teams so small that VC security measures often couldn't detect them. "We'd watch a VC camp for days," explained SS Sergeant Bob Kearney. "We'd learn their routine, identify their leaders, figure out their security gaps. Then we'd hit them at the weakest moment, usually a supply column or leadership meeting. Quick, violent, then gone. But here's the key. We always offered surrender before opening fire when the tactical situation allowed it." The psychological impact was devastating to VC operational security. They couldn't trust their own camps, they couldn't trust the jungle, and they couldn't trust that fighting to the death was their only option when facing these particular enemies. SAS Sergeant Bill Heinsohn recalled one incident in 1968. "We'd been tracking a VC squad for 2 days. Finally caught up with them at a stream. We could have killed them all. They had no idea we were there. Instead, our Vietnamese interpreter called out that they were surrounded and should surrender. 4 of the 6 did. The other 2 ran and got away. The 4 we captured gave us intelligence that led to the capture of a battalion-level supply cache. That's 4 live prisoners with intelligence versus 6 dead bodies with nothing." The numbers kept mounting. By 1969, Australian forces were consistently achieving prisoner-to-kill ratios of 1.4, while American forces averaged 125. In some SAS operations, the ratio was even more dramatic, 1.2 or even 1.1. The period from late 1968 through 1970 represented peak effectiveness for Australian counterinsurgency methods in Phuoc Tuy Province. The statistics told a remarkable story. 1969 Annual Summary, Australian Task Force. Enemy, KIA, 146. Enemy captured, 318. Chio Hoi defectors in Phuoc Tuy, 450. Australian KIA 71, kill ratio 16.1, but capture ratio 4.5, meaning nearly 1 prisoner for every 4 enemy killed. Compared to American forces in the 3 Corps during the same period. Enemy KIA 38,794, enemy captured 1,547, kill ratio 29.1, capture ratio 25.1. The Australians were achieving tactically superior results with a fraction of the resources and, crucially, were winning the intelligence war. Every prisoner was a treasure trove, explained Lieutenant Colonel Bill Henderson, Task Force Intelligence Officer. We knew the enemy's supply routes, base camps, leadership structure, and operational plans in Phuoc Tuy better than they did. And we knew it because their own soldiers told us, voluntarily. The most dramatic demonstration came during the 1969 Tet Offensive preparation. While American intelligence was largely surprised by the scope of the offensive, Australian intelligence in Phuoc Tuy had specific warning dates, target lists, and unit designations, all from prisoner interrogations and defector debriefings. We knew the 274th Regiment was planning attacks on Vung Tau and Australian base areas at least 3 weeks before Tet kicked off, recalled Major Peter Isaacs, Task Force Operations Officer. We were able to pre-position forces and disrupt their preparations. The offensive in our sector fizzled because we'd captured their playbook. Former NVA Colonel Nguyen Din Hung, who opposed Australian forces, acknowledged this in a 1995 interview. The Australians had the best intelligence in the 3 Corps. Not because they had better technology, they didn't, but because they convinced our soldiers that surrender was a viable option. This was a weapon we had no effective counter for. But here's the tragedy. The effectiveness was geographically limited. Phuoc Tuy Province, where Australians maintained operational control, showed dramatic improvement in security and population control. Villages that had been VC strongholds in 1966 were peaceful by 1969. Roads that had been unusable without armored escort were traveled freely by civilian traffic. Yet just beyond the Australian area of operations, in provinces under American tactical control, the war ground on with its familiar patterns. Massive operations, heavy firepower, uncertain outcomes, and endless body counts that seemed to mean nothing. American Colonel David Hackworth, after observing Australian operations, wrote in his after-action report, "The Australian task force has achieved in Phuoc Tuy Province what we have failed to achieve anywhere else in Vietnam: population security and genuine pacification. They have done this not with more resources, but with different methods. The question is whether we have the institutional flexibility to learn from their example." Based on current doctrine and command attitudes, the answer appears to be no. The ultimate impact was both profound and limited. Profound because it demonstrated that different approaches produced dramatically different results. Limited because those lessons remained largely confined to one province and were never scaled across the American war effort. When Australian combat forces departed Vietnam in 1971 to 72, they left behind a paradox: undeniable tactical success in their area of operations combined with strategic irrelevance to the war's outcome. Phuoc Tuy Province remained relatively secure until the final collapse in 1975. But one secure province couldn't change the war's trajectory. The lessons, however, proved enduring. Former Australian Task Force Commander Major General Colin Kahn reflected in 1989. "We proved that you could fight an effective counterinsurgency with less firepower, fewer resources, and better results if you were willing to think like a policeman instead of like an artillery officer. The enemy would surrender if you gave them a genuine reason to believe surrender was better than death. Not propaganda, actual, consistent behavior that demonstrated you valued intelligence over body counts and treated prisoners in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. American veterans who served alongside Australian forces took those lessons to subsequent conflicts. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the tactical principles that seemed so radical in Vietnam became standard counterinsurgency doctrine. Small unit operations, cultural awareness, minimal force escalation, intelligence-driven operations. And yes, treating enemy prisoners as intelligence assets rather than body count statistics. The Australian way became the only way that worked, explained retired U.S. Army Colonel Peter Mansour, who served in Iraq. In 2006-07, when we finally started winning in Iraq, we were basically doing what the Australians had done in Vietnam 40 years earlier. We just had to learn it the hard way. For the Vietnamese on both sides, the Australian approach left complicated memories. Former VC fighters who surrendered to Australian forces generally reported fair treatment and genuine surprise at the difference from their expectations. "I expected to be tortured or killed," recalled Pham Van Dong, no relation to the North Vietnamese premier, who surrendered in 1969. "Instead, I was given medical treatment, food, and questioned respectfully. The Australian officer who interrogated me spoke Vietnamese and knew my battalion commander's name. I realized then that the war was more complex than our cadre leaders had told us. The fundamental truth revealed was this: overwhelming firepower is not the same as tactical effectiveness, and body counts are not the same as intelligence. The Viet Cong surrendered to Australians, but fought Americans to the death, not because of ideology or equipment or numbers, but because Australian tactical doctrine created conditions where surrender was a rational choice instead of a suicide pact. That November day in 1966, when Nguyen emerged from his spider hole to face an Australian SAS patrol, he made a choice based on calculation rather than desperation. He knew the Australians had spotted his position. Their field craft was too good. He knew they could kill him easily, but he also knew, from stories circulating among VC units, that Australians took prisoners alive and treated them according to the rules of war. He chose to live. And in that choice lay the difference between two approaches to the same war. One that created only bodies to count, and one that created possibilities for something else.